Welcome to Chapter 6, and we are continuing to migrate our way through cost accounting into a concept called process costing. And I'm just going to skip over. Okay, so in our last lesson, we looked at job costing systems, and in those systems, all of our costs are allocated on a per job basis. Now, we could have a wide variety of products within those jobs. So what we do in this method is that we, instead of allocating based on jobs, we allocate our cost based on processes. A particular product might go through several stages on its way to finished goods. Let's say we're making wooden chairs, for example, and we have wood that's coming out of raw materials. It's going into the cutting department, then into the assembly department, then into the staining department, and then into finished goods. At any one time, we could have a raw materials inventory, work in process inventory for each of those three departments, as well as items sitting in our finished goods. So when we get to the end of our accounting period, we have to account for our costs and we assign those costs to processes. The costs that are assigned in the cutting department get rolled into the assembly department, and those get carried through into the, staining department is next. So by the time they get to the finished goods inventory, they have captured all of the costs for those processes along the way, and therefore our finished goods inventory has all of the costs for the processes that each of the inventory items went through. Here is an example from, of all things, an antihistamine manufacturing company. And this describes the various processes that the antihistamine may go through during its manufacture. And so again, just to sort of define the differences between the process costing system and the job costing system. In our job costing system, we had a single work in process account, and our costs are accumulated on a per job basis. Whereas with the process costing system, as basically the costs from the prior department get transferred with that product all the way through until that product winds up in our finished goods inventory, and then all of the costs are then attached to that product. If you think about how many jobs a company could be working on at any one time or over the period of one accounting cycle, you could have thousands of jobs, whereas that you're then accounting for on a per job basis. Whereas accounting for processes, you may have only a handful of processes that you're accounting for. So it is a somewhat more simplistic model. When we get to the end of our accounting period, we create our production report, and this basically shows the travel of costs throughout the processes. We will then need to take those process costs and translate those to unit costing information. And so we need to basically figure out how we determine when we have items that may be at their beginning stages in the cutting department, as opposed to maybe still with the paint wet, but kind of almost done and ready to transfer into finished goods, and how we account for those as units. Now, while all units we would process through our factory may not be identical, they're probably going to be similar enough. And, a big chair and a little chair still has four legs. You still got to attach all four legs. So we can use the process for these products to attach costs to them on a per unit basis because of the similarities of the processes. And as I had said previously, or at least meant to say, we're going to have a different work in process inventory account for each of our processes. Here, our example, we've got this is back to our antihistamines, where we've got blending and encapsulating, bottling, and then into our finished goods. Now, the kinds of companies that would employ a process costing system really could span a pretty wide spectrum. At one end, that we could have companies that have, believe it or not, no work in process inventory. In other words, they start and complete every single job within the accounting period. Then you've got the other end of the spectrum where we could have multiple processes and products in multiple stages of completion at the end of the accounting period, I should say. So we'll start with kind of the easier version of those, which is the companies which do not have work in process inventory, and those are known as the just-in-time firms. A service company would also fall into this, and we'll get into that in a second. In a just-in-time system, we're still going to allocate the costs as the products pass from process to process, but we are going to complete everything at the end, and because we've finished everything at the end of the period, then we've got nothing to start, we've got nothing in process at the beginning of the next period. And that might be a little difficult to imagine unless you think about it in terms of like a bakery. Now, a bakery is going to bake, decorate, and sell everything in a single day. It's not going to start baking the cupcakes, let's say, 2 days ago. I mean, bakers get up really early in the morning to go in and bake everything so it's fresh that day. And perhaps other than a day old shelf that they might have, everything is finished and ready to sell at the time that the bakery opens its doors, and hopefully the shelves are empty at the time the bakery closes its doors. Now, I have included this slide, which is an addition that I didn't used to include, and this is the downside of just in time, because you've got this concept that you don't want to have excess stock on hand. And what happens if there's a global pandemic and a run on, you guessed it, toilet paper? So this particular photo I happened to take at the West Lebanon Walmart back very early into the shutdown orders. And I thought to myself, you know, just in case, maybe I'll go pick up an extra roll or two to have on hand. And I walked into Walmart, and this is what I found. Zippity-doo-dah in terms of toilet paper. I then proceeded to go to 3 other stores to find exactly the same scenario. And what basically happened was these inventory systems were set up on a kind of an automated cycle where they could essentially predict how much purchasing customers would do in a particular time period, and they only ordered enough to make sure that they always had something on the shelves until there was a run on toilet paper. Similarly, I could have taken pictures of the hand sanitizer aisle, paper towels, Clorox bleach, all of those things looked about like this. So I think that what we saw in terms of the drawbacks of the just-in-time system certainly will cause companies to perhaps give greater thought to how really close they want to come before they're at a position where they're in a stock out like this, because there is no money to be made from those empty shelves. And there's a lot of overhead going on here. Without product to sell, yes, there were products in other aisles, but these stores are operating on pretty tight margins, and too much of this will cause a company to go out of business. We can also use sort of a blended approach with this process costing and kind of take some of the concepts from the activity-based costing and meld those into the process costing in terms of using activity rates to assign to overhead within each process. So now we're going to shift scenarios a little bit and talk about the type of firm that would have items in its work in process at the end of the period. So as I said before, each product carries with it, as it goes from one process to the next, all of the costs from the prior processes. So for example, anything sitting in process B would carry with it all of the costs from process A, but wouldn't have any of the costs from process B. And here we are at the end of the accounting period with some items in process B that may have had some processes applied to them, but yet those costs won't be assigned because until they move into process C, we wouldn't then attach costs to those. So we can't just ignore the costs associated with the processes that the items are currently sitting in, but we also can't assign costs to them as though we've finished that process either. So, what are you going to do? And basically what we do is we look at our work in process inventory in terms of equivalent units. In other words, 2 half-completed units is going to be the equivalent of 1 fully completed unit. And I'm going to actually stop this video here because I've been yammering for a bit. I will go on to the next video to then talk about how we deal with those costs and those equivalent units.